Hey, I did too. It's a really good day.
Got
two of them?
I think she's sweeter than you. You gotta talk to your daughter, kids. Her taste in men.
I'll work on it.
Hey, it's Apologetics Wednesday. Woo!
I'm sorry.
I'm going to call on you specifically.
I just apologize.
He just apologized. He thought it was apologizing. That's a different thing.
Hey, you know, as a married man, I
But ain't that every day?
What's the topic du jour, Mike?
Well, now I feel like we got a big hole to dig out.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. So, we're going to continue on our venture down the extra-biblical proof of the truth of the Bible. Let's, today, we are going to move into part 2, being the ark. Okay? So, lots of things to cover. This might be a 2 or 3 session arc. Before we finish.
let's see what you did there.
A trilogy, per se, yes. Anywho, we're going to try to keep it more serious from this point forward.
Yeah.
So we don't lose track of it.
Yeah,
So,
serious.
yes.
Straight up.
So,
Josh, talking to you, bud.
so that brings us all the way in our book up to Genesis 6. Verses 14 through 16 are the ones we're dealing with primarily today. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And you shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side, and you shall make it lower, second, and third. Everybody familiar with this verse?
Always reminds me of that Bill Cosby routine. Did you ever hear
No,
it?
no.
Okay, yeah. You have to look it up. It's really
okay.
good. No, it's actually him like acting out like the whole ark thing. Like God calls us like, ding, Noah. I want you to build an ark. What's an ark? Okay, never mind that. Make it so many cubits. Well, what's right? What's a cubit? Right.
Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about primarily today is the physical make of the ark, the physical possibility of its construction, what it's made out of, things like that. And I don't think we'll talk about its viability too much as a vessel today. That'll probably be left more for next time. But first thing we're going to talk about is what it's made out of. And it's made out of gopher wood. Now, does anybody know what gopher wood is?
Nope.
No, good. So let's go. What is gopher wood? The Hebrew here is gopher, which is the word of the day, a hapats legomenon. Does anybody know what a hapats legomenon is? This is one of those really cool words to know. So a hapats legomenon is a word that only occurs once in the entirety of the volume.
Really?
Okay? So this word only occurs once in the entirety of the text, which means we don't have any contextual reference for it. Remember how we constantly take and we look up the words in multiple verses, and we use the meaning of those verses to help indicate the meanings of some of the more complicated words, especially in Hebrew.
Right.
The dial-in, we do that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So with a hapats legomenon, that's a very complicated word that means you're on your own. Okay? You have to figure this out from this context. So, are the lights doing weird things, or are we looking too fast?
I'm trying to get a setting right. So
Okay, so I can check.
We don't know what you're talking about.
It's a problem. Our blood pressure is on one. So, it's an interesting word study here, particularly because it quickly becomes apparent that nobody really knows what it means. Okay, and here's why. By the construction of the Hebrew, when looking at the sentence structure that's used to that this gopher wood is in, it appears that the statement is in fact referring to trees of gopher rather than the wood of the trees itself. Okay, similar to the trees of olive that Solomon used to build the temple.
Okay.
So that's kind of how the sentence structure is. Now, some hypothesize that the word relates to the word for pitch, which is a very similar word called coper, okay, or gopher, and the exchange of that, and actually in the Hebrew, it's not a really great big of a difference between the two letters that generate this difference. So there is some argument that possibly it's a typo at some point, and it really was meant to be pitch. Okay, now, Glenn probably knows more about wood than most other people, and he just looked sideways at me. Wood has pitch in it, right? Sap, per se, okay? Especially green wood, things like that, cedar, things of such nature. So that's kind of what they're talking about in terms of pitch. Thus, it would be a resinous wood, or a wood that would be a source of pitch. Okay. Now, Strong's says that it's most likely cypress. Okay. What's interesting about that is when you dig into why Strong's went that direction, it becomes apparent that there's no real indicators why they went that direction. That they either used some sort of extraneous extra-biblical source that they failed to reference, or they just picked something.
Because it's a Hapax Pagana, they must have just made it up.
Yeah. Many will explain this by referring to trees that are native to the mountains of Ararat, okay, in Turkey, where the Bible states that the ark came to rest at the end of the flood. However, we talked about this last time. Where was the ark built?
We don't know.
Well, we got no idea. Okay? He didn't tell us that information. All we know is where it ended up. Now, since we don't know where that is, it doesn't do any good to explain the construction of the woods based on where it landed. Because we know it was a global event. We know that it went around the globe several times. It's unlikely that it ended up exactly where it started, or I think the Lord would have said so. And
It would have been a reason
or
for
something.
it.
Yeah, there would have been some sort of obvious, like, oh, look, I remember this place. Something of such nature. And that's also probably the most likely reason why they went with cypress in the Strong's, because cypress is native to that area as well. Now, talking more gopher wood, it's also possible that the interpretation of the text that this may have been a method of treating wood. Okay, kind of like our current understanding of pressure-treated lumber and stuff like that. The Chinese, for instance, have an ancient technique of burning lumber and then burying it, and it makes the wood harder. That's how they treat teak, to make it better for outdoor applications, things like that. There's some indication that it was a notion that Noah would have understood in the time of going down and cutting down these trees and then processing them some way that would have made them appropriate to this application. Now, do we know that for sure?
We don't think we know anything about it at all.
We don't know anything about that at all. Okay. So, is it okay that we do not have an exact reference for the type of wood this is?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It is. Now, here's some good reasons why. I try not to leave you in the lurch. We'll practice a little intellectual honesty here. Approximately 60,000 species of trees exist worldwide. Okay, 40,000 of those in the African rainforest, or 40% of those in the African rainforest. So really interesting number of species there. Of which 17,500 of them right now are on the verge of extinction. Okay. Now, here's an interesting thing. You know, nobody makes really sad, motivating commercials to save species of trees, right? You haven't seen the maple commercial or the ash commercial that talks about you know, supporting the tree's resistance against the beetles and stuff. We don't get that. However, trees are incredibly important, and words of God as well. And I would argue that we need to pay pretty close attention to what's happening with those. But it's never going to be that.
It's just not a good commercial.
Yeah, they don't have puppy dog eyes.
No, they just said it.
Yeah, the leaves fall off in sadness. I can imagine.
Little bit of sap running down.
Yeah, if you only donated $1, I wouldn't be bleeding right now. But anyways, there's a number of species in North America that are on the verge of extinction, mostly due to a fungal issue here in North America, and a couple of invasive bugs and stuff like that. Like ash beetles. Ashes are pretty common trees, at least at one point in North America. And the ash beetles have estimated to kill like 75–80% of them so far. So it's a really big number. And it's really kind of a scary thing happening. But again, no sad puppy dog commercials for them. And the other thing that we have on the book is we have knowledge of a mass extinction event, right? Known as the flood. Okay. Now, my argument here is that we don't know if this species of tree was preserved through the flood. Okay. It is quite possible we don't know what gopher wood is because it simply doesn't exist past the knowledge of the 8 people that were in the ark. Okay. We don't have leaf rubbings. I don't know of any. The memory book of trees. You ever do that here?
I made one of those 6th grade.
Yeah, good. I see you didn't keep up with it. Now, it's a good thing for grandkids. Get you some charcoal, do some.
They'll make their own.
Okay, now moving on. So, you don't notice with most of our individuals that do a lot of talking here aren't here this evening. So you guys can feel free to say something, it's okay. So, the root of the desire to understand what gopher wood is, to some degree, is in order to reflect upon the likelihood that the ark would have survived the last 4,500 years to be around today. This is an interesting question, right?
Because lots of people are looking for it.
Whenever you have a physical object that is produced in the Bible, it is always a really cool idea to say, hey, can we find said object? Okay. The cross that Jesus was on, and the I don't know how many billions of splinters I've seen attached from that thing. Mm-hmm. I've seen coins with splinters inserted into them. Even craziness. But it's been like that for thousands of years. So there's all this thing of, hey, can we actually find this? And that's part of what we're looking at in this venture too. So is it likely that this thing could have survived 4,500 years? I don't know. Yeah, Ron. Yeah. What do you say so, Ron? Why are you on the fence about that?
Well, I mean, it's just made of wood, and over that length of time between rain, wind, and whatever else.
Yeah. You remember that deck we tore apart for the journey home and had to rebuild?
It could be that too.
Away, stuff like that.
That's what I was going to say. Like, if I'm going to compare it to my knowledge of wood, like my deck did not make it 4,500 years.
Your deck was not designed by God. Now, it's a common supposition that since the ark was made out of wood, it could not have survived this element this long. Could the wood have survived? So, we actually have several examples of wood objects and structures that have survived several thousand years. And we're going to look at some of those. Does anybody know what this is? This is actually a pretty famous boat. Has a pretty famous name. It has its primary name it goes by as the Joker from the back. He was here at the same time next week, guys. So.
You told him he could talk because some other people weren't.
I know. We got to talk louder though, so we pick up in the mic so other people can mock him too.
Kelson has a thought.
Yeah. The Enterprise, there you go. This is actually called informally as the Jesus boat. Okay. It is a boat that was found in the Sea of Galilee. And it's also called the Galilean boat. Now, the Jesus boat is located it was located at the Yigal Allon Center in Israel. That's where these pictures are from. It was discovered in 1986, buried in the mucky sediment off the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Okay. Not believed to actually be the boat that Jesus rode in. All right, it's not what you're saying. But it is likely to be similar to the one that he's rode in because this dates to around 2,000 years ago. Okay. It survived that long given non-ideal conditions, right? Especially as woodworkers, whenever we think of saving wood, storing it in a sand pile in the bottom of a body of water is not really our primary impression of how we're going to preserve wood. Yet, this structure has done quite well. Now,
I got an objection.
you got an objection?
Yeah. First, I don't believe it's 2,000 years old for one reason. Because scientists say they can carbon date all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But they carbon date the Earth back billions of years, so I
Yeah.
don't have anything to say.
I will not argue too much against that. However, this is within the reasonable timeline for carbon dating. Okay, there is a window where carbon dating is reasonably accurate.
And the rest is made up.
It has to run till about 8,000 years old. And that is given some suppositions. We've talked quite a bit about that, about what happens in the problems of carbon dating. There's a lot of assumptions that are made with the amount of carbon in the atmosphere being fixed and stuff like that. Despite what everybody says today about how we have a lot more carbon in the atmosphere than we had before. Anyways, we'll let that go. But carbon dating is reasonably reliable in a short-term situation. Okay? Now, when you get to the point where you're going, hey, this is 1 million years old and stuff like that, it has a definitive problem in the reality that there's nothing really to say that it's even capable of referencing that far back. And when you do the math on it, it's unreasonable for it to do that. Now, we have documentation and stuff that exists on this earth right now that's several thousand years old. We have scrolls and stuff like that. And so this I wouldn't call as beyond the scope of reality for the age of this boat, especially given the design matches most of the known designs from that time period in that region.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Like guilty pleasure, all right? So no judgment. A couple years ago, there was this show on this dude that was like a treasure hunter, right? And so he goes all over the world looking for old shipwrecks and stuff. And so they're finding ships from the 1500s, whatever, and they never found anything but metal because everything was submerged in it. So what would make it possible for this to last underwater that long when all of that stuff disappeared?
In this construct, a lot of it probably had to do with the sediment and the environment it was in, plus the preservative nature that would have been used at the time. This boat would have been most likely, to some degree, been oiled and things like that, whereas when you're looking at predominantly metal structures, the wood that's in them is either non-structural and strictly for show. Thus, it's not necessary that it is a water viable wood that would exist in that environment.
That makes sense.
Things like that. And it's also not necessarily treated in such a way that would be a water viable over time too. That would be my primary argument.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Any objections, Chef?
No, I can stand behind that.
Okay, John. So let's look at another one. This is a beauty right here. All right, they again dug this out of some muck over in Scotland, and this is what they cleaned it up and looks like. This is known as the Carpal Longboat. It's discovered in 2001 in the south of Scotland near Abernethy in the river basin of the Tay. It dates to about 1000 BC-ish. Okay, so we're getting closer. All right. Now, here's a very impressive one. This is called the Red Boat. It was actually a series of 5 boats that was designed and built by the Egyptians. And the guy that originally discovered them in the plains of Dasher on the west bank of the Nile, 25 miles south of Cairo, in 1894 and 1895, this Jacques de Morel discovered these boats. There's actually 2 of them here in the States. One of them's in Chicago. It's actually known as the Chicago boat. It's one of this grouping. And so you can go see that one. The only reason why I didn't show pictures of that one is because all the pictures I could find were very close-ups down the length of it and didn't really exemplify much. But here you can see structurally, this is a fairly well-secured boat, right? It's got a deck, it's got under support structure. That's the original oar that they found with it. So it is a really well-preserved item. This dates back to about 1800 BC. Okay. The other thing is this one. Now, I'm showing this one just for an extreme. Okay. This is another relatively famous boat. Is what we currently believe to be the oldest boat we've come across. Does anybody know what a dugout canoe is? You do, okay. So basically what native populations would do and stuff is they'd cut down a log and they would use fire to burn a section, and then you put it out and then they dig that section out. It was a way of not being able to carve it out really well and get rid of all the bulk, so they would burn it and charcoal that section and get it out. And that's primarily how you make dugout canoes. This is a particular canoe called the Pesai Canoe, the oldest example of a water-going wood that we have. It was discovered in 1955 when they were building the Dutch motorway, basically outside in the Netherlands, through what was a peat bog. And peat is where you have the detritus and all the leaves and stuff develop into the bog, and so it's a bunch of dying material and stuff. And it's a really interesting environment, one of the wetland forms. But this dates to about 7500 BC. Now what's interesting about it, this is just a piece of wood. It's not petrified, it hasn't been mineralized, nothing weird has happened to it. Those that have touched it said it feels like wood. There's nothing weird going on with it. It's just there.
So is it carbon dating that they're using to come up with these?
On those, yeah. And that's getting
That's on the
close to
outside.
edge, yeah. There are actually several examples that look very similar to this that come about in the 6,000 range. So, you know, it wasn't worth showing you guys everything that was available out there. So, none of these examples have any evidence of actually being preserved in resinous pitch, okay, like the hardwood was, okay, much less inside and out. Now, normally when you build a boat and you're going to rub it with pitch, which is not an uncommon thing to do, we actually, in modern days, guys that are building boats in their backyard and stuff can use and have used pitch to caulk their boats and seal the outside of it. It's a very common thing to do. However, you almost never do it to the inside of the boat. You almost always just do it to the outside of the boat. So that is an interesting point. But let's look at some of the written evidence for the survival of the ark briefly as well. There is this guy named Berosus. Okay, we went over some historical stuff when we talked about Jesus, and we're going to see some of those names here again. But Berosus, it sounds like a disease condition.
It does.
I got the Berosus. He was a Babylonian from about 300 BC, and he wrote in Greek, which is nice for us. He's cited as a historical reference for Flavius Josephus. Okay? He wrote the reference books that Josephus used when he wrote. Okay. Now he also is used by Theophilus, the bishop of Antioch, and Titus Flavius Clemens, which we talked about in a little bit too. But he wrote about how people had visited the ark in the mountains of Armenia, and even taking pieces of the hardened pitch from its surface to make amulets to sell in the cities. And then this guy named Amadinus, who's a Greek historian in 200 BC, he wrote the people of the region of ancient Armenia used to collect small pieces of ark wood and put them in their homes and stuff. Now, Flavius Josephus, who we talked about, he indicated that the ark was known to have landed on a mountaintop in Armenia and still existed, and quote, its remains are shown there by the inhabitants to this day. Now, what's also interesting too is this guy named John, I forgot how to pronounce that name all of a sudden, Chrysostom. Let's go with that. He's a preacher that died in 407 AD. And in one of his preaches, he wrote his sermons, he wrote, "Do not the mountains of Armenia testify to it where the ark rested? Are not the remains of the ark preserved there to this very day for our admonition?" And Isidore Seville, a 7th century Christian writer, wrote some interesting stuff, but wrote, "Ararat is a mountain in Armenia where the historians testify that the ark came to rest after the flood. So even to this day, wood remains of it are still to be seen there." And then Marco Polo, we all heard his name before, you know, developer of a very common pool game. The Marco Polo from the 13th century said evidently he's a hard guy to find.
He should have patented that one.
That's a great commercial. I don't even know what that's for, but that commercial, whereas
Oh, that was
the kids are playing Marco Polo.
It was an insurance commercial.
Was it?
Yeah. So he said, and you must know that it is in this country of Armenia that the Ark of Noah exists, on the top of a certain great mountain, on the summit of which snow is so constant that no one can ascend, for the snow never melts and is constantly added to by new falls. So, you know, Marco Polo traveled quite a bit, and he even had people tell him that it's up there. You just can't get there right now. And we also have some 20th century examples of this that will attest to the physical presence of the Ark, and we'll get to those in a session down the road, because there's a lot to go into in that. But what I wanted to talk about right this second was about the overall nature of the design of the Ark. So the overall Ark dimensions are laid out for us pretty darn clearly. Arguably one of the most clear statements of size with outside of the temple, the tabernacle, right? So Genesis 6:14, the length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. So how big is it? Okay. So this is the first mention of the cubit in the Bible. It's the very first time they said cubit. Now, a cubit is the length from the elbow to the tip of your longest finger, okay, which is typically your middle finger, unless you've had it shaved down, but it's usually your cubit, okay. Now, there's a couple of different annotations for this. There's what is known as the common cubit, okay, which is 6 widths of the palm. And if you actually take a measure of this, it's fascinating how this works out, because God's creation is very symmetrical amongst almost all of us. The 6 widths of your palm is pretty much the length of your cubit. Okay. Now, it's known as the short cubit. Okay, and defined as 17.5 inches. With a palm is defined as 2.92 inches. Okay, so it's 2.92 by 6, and that's 6 palms for 1 cubit.
Fascinating.
This is a cubit stick. Alright? So this is a 6 cubit stick, and it has some interesting fractional deviations in there. I must admit, I spent some time trying to figure out exactly what the fractional deviations were. There's obviously a 50%, and I think a 1/3, and a 2/3, and maybe a 75% anyway. Regardless, that is a typical cubit stick. You would take the stick, you would put it up to something, the edge of it has the lip on there that would catch on the edge of something, and you would use it to measure how long it is.
Like a tape measure.
World's first tape measure.
There you go.
Okay. God had it going on. Now, a sanctuary cubit, which is believed to be, as defined actually in Ezekiel 14:5, is a palm width wider. Thus, it's 7 palms. Now, why would this be this way?
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
People that are interested with numerology, this is the number 6s and the 7s are important numbers because the number 6 represents man. Okay. The number 7 represents God, basically perfection. Okay. So the sanctuary cubit, or God's cubit, would be 7 palms. Now, I asked if anybody knew what God's palm was. They weren't sure. But anyway, there wasn't anybody to ask. I'm sorry. I asked myself in a prayer. I didn't get an answer. I was hoping for that. Maybe he'll show it to me.
That sounds like something you would do. Like Moses is like, God, I want to see your face. And you're like, God, I need to know how wide your palm is.
How wide your palm?
So I'm working on this cubit thing.
Yeah.
It's big enough to cover Moses.
Yeah, right, there you go.
Yeah. Anyways, the sanctuary cubit is 7 palms of 2.92, which comes to 20.4 inches. This is a sanctuary cubit stick. Okay, so if you count off the marks, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to the dice at the top, which I'm wondering would be representative of an and a thumim, maybe. I'm not exactly sure, but I thought it was an interesting little decoration on the end, and then the hand that would do it. But anyways, you clip the dice on the end of whatever it is, and then you would measure it based on your sanctuary cubits. When it talks about the cubit measurements of all the stuff, this is what it's actually doing. So, here we're left with the actual size. 300 cubits long by 50 cubits wide by 30 cubits high. If it's a short cubit, that's 438 feet by 73 feet by 44 feet. All right? That's pretty decent size, right? Now, if it's a long cubit, it's 510 feet by 85 feet by 51 feet. It's a beast. Now, we believe that Noah would have used what we understand to be the long cubit, okay? As this is part of how he came to be known in the sanctuary as the Lord's cubit, that this was passed down actually from Noah to those that would understand that in terms of the sanctuary stuff. So, this vessel had 3 decks. Remember it says you'll have a third and a second and such. So the square footage of 130,050 square feet, okay? So we all know how big your houses at home, maybe 2,000 square feet is, right? So here we have 130,050 square feet, which is 2.25 complete football fields, or almost 3 acres. Wow. Now it has a volume, when you add in the 30 cubits high, of 2.21 million cubic feet. Now to put that in some terms you'll understand, that's the equivalent storage space of 633 full-size semi-trailers. It's a lot of space.
A lot of space.
Yeah. So, we've got the 633 full-size semi-trailers. The interesting thing is the size of the ark is bigger than we typically think it is, okay? There is no, reality has nothing to do with the little drawing with the, you know, the animals sticking out the windows and stuff, right, and all that stuff is way too big for that, okay? The giraffe is not 20% of the size of the ark. It's just not reality. Or it's a big giraffe, so anyways. It's actually, what's interesting about this is when you look at the numbers of building a wooden vessel, this comes to the very limit of the maximum size that you can theoretically build a vessel out of wood and have it be seaworthy, okay? This has several things to do with it, but it becomes difficult to actually lay the planks of wood in such a way that they're watertight, okay? Because you gotta remember that seagoing vessels are under a lot of stress, waves beating against them and stuff. This would have been the most violent thing a wooden vessel had ever seen, would have been the flood itself. But there's too much movement between the planks, and this is caused by expansion and contraction as well. So even when the storm was going, the storm stops and the sun comes out, the problem with that is that causes the wood to shrink, okay? And if you're not careful, if your wood shrinks too much and it's not lapped correctly, you now sink. So, archaeologists discovered that the Greeks actually had a special method of laying planks that mankind had actually forgotten about until we discovered it, I think it was about 60 years ago. We rediscovered some of their boats that had this interesting way of interlaying the planks that we had totally lost. Never even had a notion of doing it this way. And it was way better than how we were doing it. Lest you think that the old guys weren't as smart as we were. Here's an interesting drawing for you for reference, because we all know the Santa Maria, right? And the Titanic and the Queen Mary 2, the QE2, but Noah's Ark on here in terms of that, at 510 feet, is right at the limit of wooden construction. To get bigger than that, you really got to start making stuff out of steel. That way you can have bigger sheets and you can rivet them overlap correctly, and steel doesn't expand and contract as much as wood does. Anybody's tried to build anything out of wood, especially like a deck that's outside, the expansion and contraction is what kills you. The screws start popping out, the nails start breaking. It really goes to town. So, as an aside, what I wanted to also talk about, and this is kind of going to be the last topic we talk about in this evening, we want to discuss the actual size of the boat and how that impacts our thoughts of its use. So the question is commonly raised as to whether or not the ark could have held all the animals that God had assigned to Noah to save, right? Mm-hmm. I've heard this question many times. That doesn't make any sense. How could they possibly fit all the animals in the ark? So Genesis 6:20, of the birds after their kind, of the animals after their kind, and every creeping thing on the earth after its kind, two of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. And then you also remember they either had 7 or 14 of the clean animals and stuff like that. And this number goes pretty high pretty quick, but not as high as you think it is. The ark did have to contain each and every single species of animals that we see today. And we've talked about this in the past, that the Hebrew word used here is min, which actually translates to kind. Okay, so it's all the animals of their kind. And all the species that we see today, or have known to exist, even those that we know that are extinct, would only need to be represented by a reproductive group of that kind of animal. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to have zebras and mustangs and all the different types of horses represented on the ark, because we know how genetics works and stuff. We've seen, especially this day and age, dogs. That's the best example.
It's a great example,
right? Yeah. So with dogs, you can put all sorts of things together with a little bit of creativity and come out with very tiny dogs that'll fit in your front pocket. That you only have to feed medium-sized kibble to. That must be really cheap to feed that animal.
Yeah, but why?
Exactly why. It'd be like a sugar glider. Anyways, it's probably only necessary to have your deviation at the family level. So remember, we talked about this before, teens play chess on fat girls' stomachs, right?
Softly.
So F being fat for family. Exactly. You knew that, right, Ron?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So now, even if required a genus level of representatives, okay? So we say, no, you know what, we're not going to back up the family, we're just going to go with the girls part of the genus, okay? We only need about 7,000 to 16,000 total animals in the ark. Okay? Now, only. Right? Only. 7,000, 16,000. Now, here's what I want you to think real hard about this. You guys have seen some animals in your days. How many animals have you seen that are over 20 pounds?
Most of them.
Most of them? Think hard about this now. Because you got mice and rats and all this stuff, and raccoons, and now raccoons eating healthy.
Raccoons.
But what it turns out is that we have actually cataloged less than 40,000 species of land-dependent vertebrates across the globe to date. Okay? Only 40,000 different species. So it's not as extreme as we like to think it is. But most animals are not large. Only about 85% of animals achieve an adult mass larger than 22 pounds. No.
Only a what?
It's the other area. I'm sorry. Only 15% of animals.
There we go.
That is a very poorly written sentence. I will resolve that for next time. Only about 15% of animals achieve an adult mass larger than 22 pounds. And the majority of animals are actually quite a bit less than that. The majority of animals actually run less than a quarter pound a piece. Okay? So they're like cheeseburgers.
I did not see that coming.
That's the first thing that hit my head. That's pretty good. About a quarter pound, we got basically stacks of cheeseburgers in the most of the animals would have likely been smaller than adult size too. God didn't tell him he had to carry a bunch of adult animals around. Okay. Plus, we know, like today, if you're going to take a species and you're going to generate new dogs, do you start with 6, 7-year-old dogs?
No.
No, you don't. You start with what?
Babies.
As young as you can get that are reproductively viable, right? Now keep in mind too, it's a long voyage they're on, right? So they don't necessarily have to be reproductively viable when they get on the boat, all right? They just got to be able to reproduce after they get off the boat, all right? That way you don't have a love boat problem going on.
You have a bunch of eggs.
And there's some argument for that too. You have to have a bunch of eggs. However, you know, you got to train all the other animals to sit on the eggs, and then you know you got a big problem with
God's in control.
God's in control. That is true. Okay? Because there always is the argument here of, hey, it's a miracle, right?
Yeah.
You know, how did Noah keep the animals alive? It's a miracle. All right. Yeah, it is. But what we're also talking about is, do we need to bring in miracles to explain this at all?
Yeah.
All right. And you know, the reality is that the majority of animals are not as big as elephants, okay, and stuff like that. Plus, he doesn't have to bring a 25-year-old bull elephant onto the ark. He doesn't need that for what he's got to do. Now, all things considered, less than half the volume of the ark would have been necessary to house all the animals. When you do the math and you figure out all the different species and the, even if you go past, you say, no, you know what, he didn't take just 7 of all the clean animals, he took 14 of everything, okay? And then you do all that math out, it actually runs about 45% of the volume of the ark is necessary to store this number of animals, which means he has roughly half the ark left to food and water and stuff like that.
Shuffleboard?
Water. Shuffleboard. Fresh water.
Activities.
Fresh water is a problem. They,
Falling out of the sky.
that is true, and it is possible, I guess, that Noah brought some buckets.
Yeah. Made of gopher wood.
No, I have actually seen some arguments for design of the boat that Noah could have used to make it advantageous for such few people to take care of a large number of animals. It's an interesting argument that goes along, and he had a gutter system that automatically supplied fresh water to all the animals. But keep in mind, it stopped raining for a long time. So
How long were they
before
on
they
the ark?
got to get out.
How long were they on the ark?
How long were they on the ark? What was it, 100 and...
Yeah, close to a year,
It
wasn't
was
it?
about a year, I thought.
Was it 300 and...
It rained 40 days and nights, and then it was like 100 something days.
I thought it was close to a year.
I thought I remember teaching in kids' church it was closer to a year.
Yeah, I think it's like 340.
The flood lasted 150 days.
And then how many days did he wait?
According to Bible chronology, a bit over a year, including all the time that they stayed on there while the water receded.
Yeah. So, there
So the flood was a certain amount of time, but then they were still on there a long time while the water receded.
Waiting for the water to go down. That's the whole, you know, put the bird out, the bird came back, and all that stuff.
Most estimates say 370 days. People that actually think they know. And I'm not sure you can nail it down like that, but in the neighborhood of a year.
There you go.
It's a long time.
It is a long time. Plus, so that's more than half a year without water falling from the sky in your argument. All right. The other interesting aspect of that is what do you do with the fecal material of the animals? You know, I've seen interesting drawings of this automatic system for that gathers it all falls out into this trench basically that gets flushed out. I was like, wow, this is incredible.
Extreme makeover.
Anyways, there's all kinds of options for that, and that can be delved into those independent things. But in reality, it is also only a year, and nobody promised that it was ideal conditions, right? That it was nobody's spending time at the sauna here and stuff. But the interesting thing is too that even if we include the dinosaurs on the ark, you got space for that too. All right, and that is a totally different discussion that I'm not particularly prepared to have. But there is more than enough space to allow for all that stuff. Plus, given what incredibly little we know about any concepts of the dinosaurs, who knows why the word for dinosaurs does not exist in the Bible?
We made it up.
The word didn't exist. The word came about in like 1860. Okay, so why is the word dinosaur not in the Bible? The word did not exist when the Bible was written down. Okay, there's a lot of prophecy in there, but yeah, nobody bothered to write that down. There are interesting things that describe things very much like dinosaurs, Leviathan,
Or even dragons.
And dragons. The descriptions of dragons is crazy, and the word for dragons occurs like 20 times. It's talked about quite a bit, to the point of basically a reptile that opens its mouth and breathes fire and stuff. So there is a reasonable amount of context for that to be in there without any real argument against it.
Yep.
And then the other thing is too, well, dinosaurs are huge, right? I mean, they're way bigger than anything we have. Again,
Not when they're born.
he doesn't have to haul around, 20-year-old brontosaurus. He gets the little one that we see in the cartoons. And they're cute and cuddly, and they sleep in the girls' rooms.
When the babies are little.
What about the growth of the animals? Do they built the ark bigger for the growth over the years?
Well, if you're only consuming 45% of its space, and the other percentage is taken down with food, okay, say you stored all of it with food, you maximized out. The thing is you're going to consume the food at the same time that you're growing. So you're going to be expanding volume that way too. Now, you can make arguments for whether or not he made cages and stuff like that. Yeah, you can. Most animals don't grow explosively in the period of a year, right? I mean, they just don't. Dogs grow really fast in their first year, but if you take a 1-year-old dog, the growth difference between 1 year and 2 years is not anywhere near that big. So, arguably, while the animals are growing, they're not going to grow an explosive amount. Plus, the food that it takes to support them is going to take up more space than their growth will, because growth is always less than food volume, because we're not perfectly efficient eaters, and that's why we poop. So.
And here we are. Casey, please ask something.
Yeah. I'm just curious, have you been to the Ark in Kentucky?
I have not.
We need to go up there.
Yeah, we do probably need to go up there one day. I've studied a bunch of their materials and stuff, and they do write some interesting stuff. I'm always frustrated with some of their documentation, especially because a lot of it is, we're going to touch just the surface, and hey, if you want to know more, come see us.
But at the very end, they give a strong gospel presentation, so I really like that. You walk through this maze.
Yeah, I've heard really good things about it. I have no particular reason for not going, other than life is busy. We'll get over there one day. And there is more than one ark on this planet that has been built. We'll probably talk about that more next time. We actually discovered a guy. Where is that guy?
Yeah.
Wales or something?
Well, no, that's where it ended up, but that's not where he's from.
The one that crashed?
I don't remember.
Yeah,
it's been a month.
There was some guy that convinced his wife to let him build an ark. That was fantastic.
Well, he actually made two. The first one was half size, and he actually took it on little tours, like through the waterways of where he was from, and then he went full blown and built a huge one. Yeah, so it's pretty awesome.
What you've seen of the Ark since you looked online at that one, is it matched closely to?
So we're going to talk more next time about the shape of the ark, because there's a lot of interesting aspects to that. What the word ark itself actually means, more like a box and stuff. There's a lot of conversation we have with that. I didn't want to start that in this one because it really is due quite a bit of information there, what it would have looked like.
So let's end with this, because we do have to get out of this. We have to get into the prayer meeting.
Yeah.
So what? Why? Why does any of this matter?
So the important aspect of this kind of extra biblical proofing construct is important because there are so many people that actually specifically leave the faith because of the Noah story. Okay, there's a lot of people And I remember this from back when I was not a believer, and you encounter a lot of people. One of the first things they do is they don't even get to Jesus and their sin and the need for a Savior and all that stuff. They tend to stop really early on. And, well, okay, even if the creation account is right, which, for the life of me, I don't understand how stupid I was then, that I would be willing to give you that point and then say, but how does the ark happen? Because I said, there's a God that creates the entire universe out of thought, and then how does he get animals on a boat and save them for a while? That sounds so hard. What are we talking about? It's stupid stuff. But when you look at the reasons why people leave the faith when they're in college and stuff like that, a lot of it has to do with this kind of unbelievable nature of this story. This is the one that gets attacked the most. And a lot of it has to do with how well the devil has managed to portray this story today, right? Because how many of you had a mental picture of the ark being this big? You did.
I can cheat though. I teach kids church.
Yeah.
We delved into
We've
this
gone
last
through
year.
it.
I
You've
talked
gone
about
through
how
it
many
before.
School buses were together and high, and
Yeah.
it was really cool.
So the automatically in our head, we were undersizing the miracle, right? Already we were downsizing, which is Americans were big on supersizing. Here we're downsizing, all right. But the interesting aspect of that is then we start to attack it. Well, how do you fit all that many animals on the boat? How do you do this? And how do you do this? And how do you do that? It just doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody believe in this? Fairy tale folklore, okay, stuff like that. Because it gets reduced to a fairy tale story, okay? They leave out the death, the carnage, and the mayhem, and they turn it into children's books for 3-year-olds.
It's one of my biggest pet peeves in the whole world, is how we have made the Noah's Ark story a toy for kids to play with. And it's a cute little boat with a lot of smiling animals, and there's usually a rainbow in the package, and everybody's smiling. This is the most cataclysmic event in world history, where everybody on the planet, other than 8 people and a few animals, died. And that, the comicization, I know that's not a word, of that story is why it's hard for logical people to accept that it actually happened. Because they've got a mental image of that little boat with the big giraffe sticking his head way out the window, right? It drives me nuts.
Now, as Christians, I think one of the biggest problems we have is actually with the aftermath. All right, we've all seen hurricanes and what they do to shorelines and stuff. Envision the world after this. The slate is wiped clean. All right, they're not getting out to the new Garden of Eden and stuff like that. This is a nasty environment. There is waste everywhere. I, unlike a lot of guys, don't think there's a lot of dead bodies around and stuff. I think pretty much most of that has probably been dealt with because of the long period of time. And we see a lot of burial. That, the Lord buries a lot of stuff in the flood. And we'll talk about the flood more when we get there. But we spent a year talking about the flood before, basically. And there's a lot of stuff to go over there. We're not going to go over all that again. But anyways, there is so much about this particular story that is under attack, and if you convince people that this didn't happen, then you have now started to crumble the foundation that Christ stands on.
Yeah.
Okay? Because Christ talks about the ark, right? And the stuff that happened there. So it's an important point that I'm a firm believer that we never need to cede ground to the enemy. Okay? There is nothing in the Bible that we need to apologize for, that we need to allow people to discount. There's none of that. Okay? We do not need to cede any ground to any argument. Because guess what? God's on our side. Why would we give up ground?
Yeah.
Really, anything? Yeah, the Israelites or something.
And so, you know what? We believe all of this simply by faith because we know God is real, and so everything He says is true. And we just believe that, no matter what. But outside of that, you can logic your way through this with somebody who is a die-hard atheist, who says, there's no way that was even possible. And you say, no, actually it is. Do you know how big this thing was? Have you done the math? Who told you it wasn't possible? Why do you think that? Why do you believe that? Whether it happened or not is a different conversation. But if you tell me it's not possible that it happened, no, I can stoop to your level and have that conversation. Because that's not even a faith issue. We can prove that it could have happened. And we need to do that. We need to shake the foundations of the faith of atheists. We need to make them uncomfortable with how sure they are of things that they cannot possibly know because they're not true.
Couldn't you also make that, talk to them about, they had 8 people building this monstrosity. That's just a lot of work. Because they had to fall the timber and do all that.
That's why it took 100 years.
Right. So that had to be, God had to have a hand in all that stuff.
Let's finish with this. Jeannie is online. She did the research for us. And she's exactly right. Floodwater started February 17th, well, in the second month, the 17th day, Genesis 7:11. And He told them it was time to leave the ark on the 27th of the second month in the next year. So they were on the ark for a year and 10 days.
Wow.
Exactly. Scripture wins.
Remember that.
All right, any last comment?
No, I think we're in a very good place to move on for next.
All right. Lord, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you for this scientific, logical, real-world information that we can take and put in our toolbox and use to not defend our faith, but to chip away at the foundation of people who have put their faith in evolution and science and all of that stuff. We desire to be used by you. And if we're going to encounter people who have no faith, we need to be able to speak to them in the conversations they are willing to have. And we are never going to win somebody to you, Jesus, by these facts. But we can enter into the conversation with them and let them know that they do not have a monopoly on truth. They do not have a monopoly on facts. They cannot simply disregard what we have faith in as a fairy tale because it couldn't have logically happened. And so I thank you that though you call us to believe by faith, you give us this overwhelming evidence. And we haven't even gotten into the specifics of the boat that you designed and whether it was seaworthy and what was it possible of accomplishing and all of that. That's mind-blowing, really, when we get to that. So, Lord, just thank you that the evidence piles up and piles up and piles up. You have never asked any of us to believe in anything that later on, in all honesty, we had to throw it away because it just can't be believed. So even though we are comfortable with miracles, we are comfortable with the fact that you spoke the world into existence and you can do anything. You can stop time like you did in Joshua's battle. You can make a day longer than a day is if you want. Even though we know that miracles are true. We know that you parted the Red Sea. We know that you did all of these amazing things that are outside of logic and science and the laws of physics and everything else. Still, there is so much because you're the one who designed science. You're the one who designed physics. There's just so much of your story that lines up perfectly with real science, with real data. And I'm thankful for that, Lord. Thank you so much for that. You didn't have to give us that, but you did. May that give us a confidence to enter into any conversation. There's no conversation you have to be afraid of. So Lord, use us. Send us out into the world to share this information with somebody who needs to hear it. That might be the chink in their armor that opens into a gaping wound that you come in and heal, Lord. Bring people to salvation through these conversations. It's in Jesus' name. God's people said? Amen. Amen. All right, we're really late. If you have the Zoom link, join us for the prayer meeting immediately. And if not, we'll see you Sunday. But until then,
love God, love everybody else.